So let's remember that in my State Department walkthrough, it is late August 2014. And the Americans are putting down sanctions on Russia for their behavior in Ukraine. And the press corps is um, incredulous at the notion that, well, I mean, they can look at the situation and say, you put down sanctions before and it hasn't had any effect. So what makes you think that putting down more sanctions is going to have the effect that the previous sanctions didn't have? In fact, it seems like the more sanctions you put down, the more Russia escalates. Which is what you would expect, right? Really. If you consider that sanctions are an act of war, you would expect the Russians to react accordingly. But all you're getting from the State Department is this idea that if you put sanctions on their economy, then it will provide an incentive for the Russians to reverse their actions and go back to the community of nations or some stuff like that, right? Even though it's clear that nobody wants Russia in there. Because it may change in a sort of a generational basis, but right now, like, all the way through from Canada, well, we had an election in Canada, but in 2014, Canada, Germany, Britain, like, all of these countries are run by old Cold Warriors, right? Stephen Harper was like, he wishes the Cold War never ended. And you got Merkel, with all the East German baggage. You got Cameron in the States, who was very similar to Stephen Harper. And, I mean, if not Obama, at least Clinton is very Cold Warrior, right? So what does going back to the community of nations even mean? But regardless, it seems like the journalists kind of understand the Russians better than the State Department, which is really scary, right? Of course, it's easy to construct what the State Department is actually thinking, which is America is the global hegemon, and it has the right to punish people for doing things that it doesn't like. But in order to actually believe that and take that seriously, you have to live in a bubble, right? It's a culture that's grown up around, Washington think tanks that's based on, these theories and that theories. And it's just kind of developed in this, it's developed in this kind of isolation, right? It's an echo chamber, and it's isolated itself from the reality of the situation. But if you're in that culture, and the entire Democratic administration is, as well as most of the Republican administration, really the entire Washington establishment, is in this bubble, where they really honestly believe that America is the dominant, like, is runs the world, right? Some of them may even think of strange things like manifest destiny, or what's the updated term for that? American exceptionalism. Okay, not only do they think that they run the world, but they think it's God's will that they run the world. That's crazy. You know, the only country that I can think of that has ever really thought that seriously? I mean, like, even the Romans didn't really think that. I mean, okay, maybe the very late Byzantines kind of did, right? But the only nation that I can think of that actually thought that at the peak of their empire was the Caliphate. Have we gotten to a point where the American Empire is ideologically comparable to the Caliphate? Like, even the papacy never. I mean, they had the whole uh, Divinity of Kings. What's the technical? I'm missing the technical term for it. Um, but it's not the same thing as thinking that God made us. God put us in charge. And it's scary, warped, fucked up thinking, right? And I mean, when you talk to them, you won't hear it right off the bat, right? It's not like a surface thing. But you scratch a little bit and you'll hear it, right? Even if it's not explicit, it's in their attitudes, right? You ask, who died and made you? Well, Jesus. So they think that they have the right to tell the Russians what to do because God, right? God made them exceptional, right? And like I say, this is, whatever propaganda roots this idea has, the actual leaders, the policymakers, the people in the department actually believe this. And even, like I say, even if it's not explicit, it's underneath the surface. It's something that's taken for granted, right? And if you're in that bubble, if you're in that culture, it's not even questioned that America does have the right to control the world. America is the policeman of the world. The hegemon, it can tell people what to do, and it can punish people when it doesn't like what they do. Now, if you're Iraq, there's not much you can do about that. If you're Cuba, there's not much you can do about that, so long as the Soviets don't have your back. If you're Egypt, there's not much you can do about that. If you're Israel, there's not much you can do about that. But if you're Russia, there's something you can do about that. And so the discussion, it's the State Department is saying that they're carrying out actions that will lead to a rational reaction. The journalists are saying, well, shouldn't you try something else if you want this outcome? When both of them are missing the point, which is that the Russians actually, get this guys, the Russians actually think that they're sovereign. They actually think that they don't have to listen to the Americans. And they actually interpret dictates by the Americans as actions of hostility. They can be met with nothing else but force. Now, here's something that Americans have a really hard time doing, and that Russian experts plead with Americans to do. Try putting yourself in their shoes. Okay? If some other country, let's say China, put sanctions on America in order to have it do something like pull out of Guantanamo, right? Let's say China decided it wasn't going to trade with the United States until it pulls out of Guantanamo. What would you expect the Americans to do? You'd expect them to put more people in Guantanamo, to declare it an act of war, to put their own sanctions on. It would be a trade war, or possibly a hot war. So why do you expect the Russians to react differently? Because you're the Americans. You're exceptional. You're the hegemon. You're the global power. But the Russians don't really accept that. And so rather than talk about what actions can be done to incentivize the Russians to do this or that, maybe people should realize that the Russians have the right to do what they want because they're a sovereign state. And they're going to do what they want. And they're going to interpret attempts by other sovereign states to coerce them into doing things as an act of war. And hence, of course, they're going to react negatively and aggressively to what they view as an aggressive act. Just like you would react aggressively to something that you think is an aggressive act. I'm 2 years behind on this. I have a lot to say about these sanctions, and it will come out over time as I go through these. But I actually am of the view that the American sanctions on Russia may be the single biggest error in the history of the United States. That's an incredible statement, and I do not joke when I'm not exaggerating. I actually think that, I'm not saying, I think that it may be, when people look back in history, they may interpret that as an error that is beyond parallel in American history. When we look at the ramifications that they have, the ramifications that the Russian sanctions for Ukraine had on Iran, for example. And we'll have to see this as it develops. The story as it develops is not going to be the story that you heard in the media, because you're not allowed to know what actually happens. The Russians were willing to play. I mean, it's not the sanctions that really caused the problem. It was the coup, right? But the sanctions, instead of stepping back and saying, okay, wait a second, we shouldn't have done this, and instead of Obama saying, okay, there was some elements in my administration, because I don't think Obama had anything to do with it. I think these were elements that were acting outside of his oversight, and in fact, probably outside of the oversight of the minister. These were rogue elements in the State Department. That's my understanding, right? They were all Republicans. Victoria Nuland and the whole thing. It was like this Republican clique that was left in place. They left them in place, and they came up with this scheme, right? And I don't really think that the Democratic Party really had anything to do with it. But instead of looking at the situation and being honest about it and saying, okay, we didn't have enough, we should have had more oversight of it, they went with it and they ran with it, right? They should have condemned it at the time. Which is why it's the sanctions that is the mistake. And like I said, when you look at the ramifications in Iran, the ramifications in China, the ramifications in Saudi Arabia, when people look at the causes of decline and collapse of the American empire, those sanctions are going to be key. Not the dominant thing, okay? Not the only thing. But definitely one of the turning points. And as I say, and I state this with no attempt at hubris, it may very well go down in history as the single greatest error in the history of the United States. But like I say, we'll have to see as this develops. For now, the point I'm trying to make is that nobody in this room is realizing. So the State Department is talking about how they believe the incentives will work. The media is talking about how they question whether the incentives will work and whether they should try something else. Nobody in the room is for a moment acknowledging that the Russian Federation is a sovereign state and is under no obligation to obey American dictates. And that to me is remarkable.